Bonjour, Monsieur Président, Mesdames et Messieurs et mes enfants. Good day, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, and young people. Aujourd'hui dimanche est le 14 juillet. Today, Sunday, is the 14th of July. Le 230e anniversaire de l'assaut contre la Bastille, la prison fortifiée à Paris. The 230th anniversary of the assault, the attack on against the Bastille, the fortress prison in Paris. Ce fut le commencement de la Révolution française sous le règne de Louis XVI. It was the commencement, the beginning of the French Revolution under King Louis XVI. La classe contre la classe. Les paysans contre la bourgeoisie. So you had a situation where one class of society was against another class of society. The peasants against the bourgeois class and many others. But worse than that, you had factions within each class fighting against each other. So you never knew who was going to denounce you, that you would take a ride in a horse and cart and have an appointment with Dr. Guillotine. Les événements travaux peut-être l'origine après la rumeur de Paul de la reine Marie-Antoinette. The issues found their origin in the rumored remarks of Queen Mary Antoinette. Apparently, she had a staff of 369, and one day, it is said, she asked a question. Why are the crowds so angry? What's the problem? And somebody said, well, they've got nothing to eat. They're hungry. And maybe someone made a rather facetious, sarcastic remark like this and said, s'il n'y a pas de pain, if there is no bread, que mangeons un morceau de brioche. Then they eat a sweet bun. Not a cake, gâteau is cake. Now, whether she actually made those remarks, I don't know. Whether the incident was fake news or not, but it's certainly good press. Conclusion. In conclusion, la pauvreté et la puissance étaient trop forts contre les paysans. The poverty, the wretchedness, and the pressure was too strong against the countrymen and the countrywomen, the peasants. So, ô armées citoyens, formez vos bataillons, marchons, marchons. All hearts resolved, victory or death. History can be boring, but those who don't learn from the mistakes of history are destined to repeat those same mistakes. But his story, i.e. God's story, is not boring. So, attendez-vous, écoutez-vous, s'il vous plaît. Please pay attention. Please listen, if you please. Now, there are no prizes for guessing what the subject is all about. It's obviously about the French Revolution, foretold in the Holy Scriptures of truth, the Bible, some 1700 years before it happened. But the consequences and repercussions around the world still occur. Therefore, it has a meaning for us here today in 2019. So I thought that by my introduction, I would try to convey to you a little of the background, the atmosphere, so we could get the feel of the subject. Why did we read Revelation chapter 16, verse 13? And I saw 3 unclean spirits, like frogs, come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. And verse 14, we go on to explain that, for they are the active teaching, the policies of madness, working signs, in the Revised Version, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world. Yes, where you are now, listening to this. The whole world, globally. Why? To gather them to the war, Revised Version, of the great day of God Almighty. So we're going to do a little research, a little detective work. In Proverbs 25, verse 2, it says, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. You've got to do some work. God has concealed, by the way he's written things, certain plans and purposes, what he wants people to know and to do. And God wants our intelligence. He wants us to search out and find out what he really wants, and so we draw closer to him. So we go back to AD 420. A man by the name of Pharmond, Pharmond, first king of the Franks, and he had a shield, on which were 3 frogs, but no lilies. In the tomb of his successor, Childeric, was found a medal, on which was the shape of a frog. We move on half a century or so, and Clovis, king of France, the son of Childeric, he had on his shield 3 frogs and 3 lilies. He was the first Christian king of the Franks. Lily in French, fleur de lis, a white trumpet-like flower, early emblem of the French kings. The point we want to keep in mind is that the lily represented the ruling class, whilst the frogs, those who were ruled. Now, something else that happened in history. Because of the decline of the power of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, which had been set up by Emperor Constantine, and this decline was caused by the Arab Saracen successes in the AD 600s in that part of the world, the Pope of the day in Rome now had to look elsewhere for military support to prop up his religion, as you might say. So in 773 AD, the Pope of the day, Pope Hadrian, obtained help from Charlemagne, king of the Franks in Europe. On Christmas Day, AD 799, it's rather strange because in some encyclopedias it says Christmas Day AD 800. An alliance was completed by Pope Leo III and the Empire of the Franks. So the union of church and state was now complete. But the Apostle John, writing the apocalyptic vision, Revelation 16 verse 13, did not see 3 unclean spirits like lilies. As we know, he saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs in a position of power and authority, issuing mad, demoniacal, governmental policies. So what we want to take note of here at this moment is if the lilies were on the shield in the AD 500s and onwards, but John saw them absent from the shield later, something must have happened. At this point, when John recorded the vision in AD 96, the Franks were more or less barbarians in the marshes. For the marshes, of course, is the home of frogs, of Westphalia, a part of what is now West Germany, but north of the borders of Holland, Luxembourg, and France in that area. Frogs, their croaking often booms throughout the night. Frogs distend, blow out their cheeks. They pop them out. Frogs can camouflage, disguise themselves, and they have poisonous skin glands. So the originator of that political cartoon, Revelation 16 verse 13, we'll come to this later, God could see forward in time and record for us 1700 years before and warn us when the frogs would be in power and have status, when they would have an influential voice far beyond their original marshy swamps, when their voice would become worldwide, would become global, that their influence would penetrate and permeate the deliberations, the discussions, and the policies of the nations, thus leading these nations to war to fulfill God's purpose. Now, sometime, at your leisure, open up the Bible, Exodus chapter 8, the second book of the Old Testament. What did the plague of frogs that God brought upon the Egyptians accomplish? Yes, the frogs were a nuisance. Yes, they created a bad smell. But as a result of this plague, Pharaoh promised the Israelites liberty. Take away the frogs, and I will let the people go. Exodus 8 verse 8. But it was a false promise, because the Israelites still remained enslaved. Now, if we turn to Psalm 78, it mentions frogs which destroyed them, reading the Authorized Version, verse 45. But the word shouldn't be destroyed, it should be corrupted them, or really morally corrupted them. So keep that in your mind. The London newspaper, The Times, of June the 30th, 1790, I didn't say 1970, I said 1790, and the writer was having written an article about the French Revolution, and he described it as the mad spirit. knowingly or unknowingly, confirm the apocalyptic description of the same. Again, writing of the French philosopher Voltaire, who had recently died, this writer of the London Times newspaper, July the 5th, 1791, 228 years ago, and he wrote thus: "The French people were mad to have honoured an apostle of infidelity who had corrupted them." The demoniacal wisdom of the times, that is, the times in which people were living, not the newspaper, a philosophy brought forth like an abundance of croaking frogs, entered into the chambers of all the kings of Europe, was promising liberty. What did it bring? It brought moral corruption and brought millions under a cruel bondage, which was later brought to perfection by such people as Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin. Remember the Siberian salt mines and the lead mines and the Gulag detention camps, and of course with Kim Jong-un. Basically, this doctrine emanated from France, and the French people are often derogatively referred to as frogs. That's not PC these days. Out of the mouth of. Now, the mouth expresses the doctrine and the policy of the body to which the mouth belongs. The doctrine and the policy was exported to Europe by Napoleon in his first campaigns, which he was the champion of nationalism. Liberty became the basis of democracy. "My policy," said Napoleon, "is to govern men as the majority wish." Many other doctrines made their appearance in the 19th century, socialism and so on and so on and so on, but we haven't time to look at them. They were all unclean spirits, the spirits of demons working signs. Now, the New Testament was written in Greek. To the ancient Greeks, a demon was a deified spirit that controlled a person's destiny. Demon, to distribute fortune. The frog-like doctrine and policy was that people should have the right to share in the control of one's own destiny. Now, did you read here in New Zealand the placards of the demonstrators of several weeks ago in favour of abortion? On TV, there was a young woman there holding up a placard, "My ovaries are my business." Also, you may have noticed that the demonstrations in recent months, or even longer, pro-abortion, teacher strikes, whatever, the protesters are very noisy, whether they've been in Algeria, Albania, and all points in between, Khartoum, Hong Kong, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe, from A to Z. Very noisome. They've been erupting like a noisome ulcer on the body of the world. But out of the many mouths, out of which these three unclean spirits come, Scripture directs us to consider three particular ones: the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Well, who are these? The key is found in the prophecy of Daniel, the Bible being its own interpreter. political cartoons. Now, in the Christchurch Press, there's a cartoon here of 44 years ago, and in the farmyard, there was a chicken that is now minus feathers. It's got on there an L, which is the Labour Party, and Wallace Rowling has lost the election, and a huge pile of straw or hay in the same farmyard. On there is a rooster crowing away, very proud, but it has a face, and the face is Robert Muldoon, the leader of the National Party, who will now be New Zealand's next Prime Minister. So the cartoon is understandable, and it is accurate, and God's political cartoons in the Bible are exactly the same. The dragon represents the eastern section of the Roman Empire. It was divided into two parts, Byzantium, Constantinople. Historically, it was the military mouth of the Roman Empire, and will be again the seat of which had been moved to Moscow. Now, Moscow also is has 7 points of high ground and is known as the Third Rome. Byzantium fell on May the 29th, 1453, on a Sunday, and from then on the mouth got moved north. In this period, when the unclean spirits go forth, according to the scripture, therefore, the mouth of the dragon now exists in Moscow and proclaims a frog-like spirit. It did in 1905 and 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, which we'll come to later. Now, the next mouth was the mouth of the beast, known for many centuries for its blasphemy against God. Blasphemy means claiming to be what you're not. And this represents the Latin-speaking west of the Roman Empire, the European mainland. The beast of the earth, Revelation 13, verse 11, came out of the beast of the sea, Revelation 13, verse 1. The beast of the sea in the Mediterranean, in the Greek-influenced area. A rift actually occurred between these two sections, which doesn't matter now. So we'll go back to Charlemagne, and Charlemagne in the west now filled the gap, providing the military support for the Pope, which had been lost over in the east. A commentator describes or writes and says that the Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, and wasn't an empire. Anyway, so today the body of the beast is reforming and emerging in the development of a European superstate, the European Union. Let's come to the third mouth, which is that of the false prophet, Rome, the civil and religious capital of the Roman Empire. A dominant religious influence in the world today is the Pope in the Vatican City. July the 18th, 1869, the Pope, whoever he was at that time, declared himself infallible. And I think all subsequent popes did the same. For many years, the Vatican opposed the principles of the French Revolution and was the enemy of communism. But in 1963, at the Second Vatican Council, it did a U-turn, and thus a frog-like spirit teaching came out of the mouth of the false prophet. A dialogue began with the atheist, the theos. In Greek is without, theos, God, without God. In the Kremlin, there's a dialogue set up between the Kremlin and the Vatican. So obviously an alliance is building up between the Roman Church and communism. Now I have here an item from the Christchurch Press, the New Zealand South Island main paper, the 19th of July, 1989. That's 30 years ago. The Vatican's new link. After 45 years, the first time the Vatican has now established a diplomatic relationship with the communist nation of Poland. Watch this space. Let's go back in time to what was happening in France. As a result of France's support for the papacy, it became known as the eldest son of the church. Edward Gibbon, an English historian who died in 1744, he wrote the 6 volumes entitled The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Now, he had converted to Roman Catholicism, and it's rather strange for what he writes. He had this to say: Catholicism's popes made France as bees make their hives, cell by cell, overlapping and interlocking. Now, Catholicism's doctrines and creeds are not in accordance with God's truth, so it was inevitable that conflict should arise between believers and non-believers. Persecution of believers has been bitter in that country of France in the past, and because of this, the royal house of Bourbon, we'll look into later, and France itself, were guilty of the shedding of the blood of God's true witnesses, and must therefore be at the forefront of God's punishment. We will briefly look at 3 French kings of the Bourbon dynasty. Louis XIV, he became king at the age of 4 in 1642 and ruled for 72 years. He built up France's status in Europe. He was known as Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, and Dieu donné, God-given. Instead of staying at his normal palace, he had an enormous, ornate palace of more than 300 rooms, built at Versailles, 10 or 12 miles east of Paris. But what he did was he centered all power on that place and on himself, which was a cause of dissent and controversy much later. He became known as, or he classed himself as, L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. So there was a close alliance between the nobles, who should have been out in the provinces looking after their people in their areas, and the church hierarchy, a powerful clique. When Louis XIV died, the sun had set. He was succeeded by Louis XV. He lived, personally, a scandalous life. In his reign, saw the emergence of a professional class of doctors, lawyers, bankers, and merchants, the bourgeois class. But things were going wrong, and Louis XV didn't care much about what was happening. Taxation was a vexatious subject. Those who could afford the most paid the least. Those who could afford the least paid the most. A hard-working peasant paid 4/5 government taxes, local nobles, and tithes to the church, 81 cents in the dollar in our language. But to make life more difficult, there were 8 or 9 years of unusual weather patterns. There was a mini climate change. Apparently also a volcanic ash from the volcano in Iceland drifted across part of Europe. There were poor harvests. Breaking news. It's not really breaking news, it's just a few weeks ago. The 26th of June 2019, on the Al Jazeera News, the Arabic news in English, Channel 16, the United Nations report climate change by 2030, 10.5 years' time, could push 120 million people into poverty. It doesn't say whereabouts this will occur. Louis XV remarked, "Après moi, le déluge." After me, the flood. And he was right. He was followed by Louis, teenager of 16, who married another teenager of 15 or 16, Marie Antoinette, the 15th child of Empress Marie Theresa of the Habsburg family of Vienna. But when he became king, as Louis XVI, he was described as an administrative dolt, clueless. He lacked drive and initiative when the nation was in decline, crying out for leadership. Upon him fell the deluge. But something else was happening that was fueling the cry for change. The pen is mightier than the sword. Thinkers and writers were beginning to attack the system of government that was in that area in Europe at that time. An Englishman, John Locke, appealed to people's minds. He lived 1632 to 1704. And he wrote that by common sense, people agreed to submit to a government that would guarantee order and protection. The right to rule comes from the ruled. In 1688, there was a change in England. Absolute monarchy was replaced by a constitutional monarchy. That is, the sovereign doesn't rule, the sovereign simply reigns. Locke's ideas spread like leaven among the educated in Europe. French was the language of culture. And one of their number, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, known as a dreamer, appealed to people's hearts. In 1762, he wrote, Du contrat social, of the social contract. Now, let's summarize these writers. These writers were spreading a philosophy, and we can look at 3 headings, 1, 2, and 3. The philosophy they were spreading was this: the essential goodness of human nature. 2, the sure guidance of common sense and reason. 3, majority rule is the source of real power. But in opposition to the philosophy of men, God has declared in his word 3 things. 1, human nature is evil, Romans 7. 2, natural thought is astray from right, Romans 8. 3, all power is of God, Romans 13, verse 8, and elsewhere. Violence had no part in Locke's and Rousseau's writings, but two other French writers were stirring revolution by violence. In all these crises that was happening, especially in France, King Louis XVI faltered. The treasury was broke, hopelessly in debt. It had been involved in the American War of Independence. The moneyed class of people in France feared they wouldn't get the money back that they had loaned. Tourists stayed away from Paris for fear of violence. Food and fuel were expensive. There were bread riots. The government and king were disunited. One mom gained access to Les Invalides, a home for wounded soldiers, and also a military museum, and took muskets and cannon. Another group of disaffected social activists, using today's speak, assaulted the Bastille, and 150 attackers were killed or wounded. After 4 hours, the defenders surrendered and promised safe passage. But some were butchered. The governor beheaded with a penknife. The Bastille's collapse foreshadowed the collapse of feudalism. 3 weeks later, the 4th of August, feudal privileges in France were abolished by the État Général, the States General. Mob rule took over in October. We'll not go into details, we haven't the time. The royal family, at some point, were moved from the palace to a hotel, the Hotel de Ville, in Paris. On the balcony one day, Lafayette, a French nobleman who had fought the English in the American War of Independence, presented Louis with a cockade, a rosette of red and blue, representing the people of Paris. But you remember that Louis XVI, in his hat, already had a cockade, a white one. The king was speechless and humiliated. The crowd cheered. Those three colours became the tricolor, the vertical blue, white and red of the French flag. Time passed, events happened, and the king, who had tried to escape the country with Marie Antoinette, was tried for treason and guillotined on the 21st of January 1793. But what about his wife, Marie Antoinette? She was born in Vienna, excuse me, Sunday, the 2nd of November, 1755, All Souls' Day, according to the church calendar. The day after, Saturday, November the 1st, All Saints' Day, according to the church calendar. The day after the great Lisbon earthquake. And the fire and the tsunami, which destroyed 2/3 of Lisbon and killed, guesstimates vary between 10,000 and 100,000 people. She was guillotined on October the 26th, 1793, 7 days before her birthday, at a time of great social and political earthquakes in France. She wore white, the colour of the lily, symbol of the Bourbon dynasty. People power, the three frogs, had overthrown the lilies, royalty, the ruling class. Bible prophecy had come true. God says what he means and means what he says. Very comforting for us to know that. To all intents and purposes, the French Revolution ended in 1794, and some say as long as later, 1799. But there was a domino effect. The rallying cry had been, in French, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. This slogan was to become France's greatest export. Winston Churchill wrote, "The convulsion which shook France in 1789 was totally different from the revolutions the world had seen before. The French Revolution was to spread out from Paris across the whole continent. It gave rise to a generation of warfare, and its echoes reverberated long into the 19th century and afterwards." But how did that occur? A lot of the Middle East and Southeast Europe and parts of North Africa was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, when the river Euphrates, the symbol of Turkey, was in flooded out over many lands. But now countries wanted to throw off that oppressive yoke. They wanted liberty, equality, and fraternity. I do not know the sequence, but Greece became independent in 1820. Later, France took Algeria. Much later, Britain took Egypt. The Balkan countries revolted. The river Euphrates, representing Turkey, was drying up from its outer shores. Turkey became known as the sick man of Europe. Let's go back to the pen. Another writer came to prominence, Karl Marx. Both his grandfathers were Jewish rabbis. Karl's father switched religions. Opportunist. He became a Lutheran. There were two reasons. He wanted to avoid being persecuted because he was a Jew, and he wanted to advance his career. Karl was christened into that church. He would have known, grown up, hearing of such false doctrines of heaven going and hell punishments, whatever. Later he would write, "Religion is the opiate, the drug of the people." Yes, he was right. False religion is. It drugs people. Truth does not. The people were duped by church lies. Yet Karl, later, who became a journalist, teamed up with Friedrich Engels, and both of them were to publish in 1848 in Belgium, because they had to flee from France because of their ideas. They published the Communist Manifesto. Yes, from each, according to his ability, to each, according to his need. Share and share alike. A level playing field. Very commendable. Yet, the masses who would find themselves even more cruelly oppressed by believing the people who were intent on forcing these ideas on their country by terrorist means, they would be cruelly misguided. These policies came from puffed up people, puffed up political platitudes, poisonous slogans, camouflaging their real intentions. However, these frog-like philosophies will still be eagerly read and spread. So let's see. Let's jump forward half a century. In 1898, in Russia, there were secret Marxist groups formed illegally, known as the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Though it was in two groups, both claimed to follow Marxist policies. Representatives of these two groups attended a meeting in London in 1903. There were disagreements and walkouts in the meeting. The smaller group that was left there now, led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, fortunately he changed his name to Lenin, now became the majority. Bolsheviks, that's what the word means. But Lenin had a theory of his own, different from Karl Marx. And his theory was that a small political party of professional revolutionaries, read armed thugs, should be added to Karl Marx's theories. And they would use force and terror in their planned forthcoming Russian revolution. They would seize the government, the workers and peasants, and Lenin would rule as a dictator, barring all opposition. World War I. Russia was being badly mauled by Germany. Because of war weariness, famine, poverty, strikes, and so on, the Tsar, the king of Russia, Nicholas II, who was like Nebuchadnezzar, believed in his absolute authority and not in the parliamentary system. He abdicated March the 15th, 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution, it had a different catch cry, was bread, peace, and land. Started on October the 26th, 1917, if you use the old Russian calendar, or November the 7th for the new Russian calendar. So, Lenin, who hated religion, came to power and set up the world's first communist dictatorship, the Comintern, the Communist International. The Tsar, what happened to him? He was on a collision course with destiny. The Tsarina, the queen, his wife, 4 daughters and son, were moved to the Ural Mountains and murdered on July the 17th, 1918. The frogs had won again over their rulers. The Russian flag from 1699, horizontal white and blue and red, was reinstated in 1991, but is replaced in 1918 by a sole red colour. And up on the top left was a yellow hammer and sickle, representing the workers and the peasants. Red, revolution and blood. Stalin came to power after some time. He came in 1929. And then you had gulags, labour camps, Siberian salt mines, and so on. And the loss of 20 million people. So France's best export had reached the Bering Sea, the sea between the eastern part of Russia and the American state of Alaska. The frog spirit had boasted a better deal, but its intentions were camouflaged by poisonous policies. We shall stay in the Far East because the export now took root in Shanghai on a boat moored in the river, July the 21st. July 1921. The Chinese Communist Party was formed in secret. Zhou Enlai, Mao Zedong, and others. Perhaps in February 1997, a Chinese student with whom I was travelling in the Chinese New Year took me on board this boat. For her, a must-see attraction. We go back a bit in time. 1924, the sixth giant of Asia, China, was in a state of anarchy and rebellion. Fights, feuds, feudalism, famines, warlords. Women in those days had their feet bound. Cruel landowners. A deeply in-debt peasant may have to pay off by selling his daughters. The country was rightfully formed by revolution, which broke out in the 1930s and lasted until 1949. There was a lull in the civil war between those two parties from 1937 to 45, when both sides fought the Japanese invasion. But in 1949, the defeated nationalists under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek retreated to the tobacco leaf-shaped island of Formosa. Beautiful isle, to give it its Portuguese name, Taiwan. But on October the 1st, 1949, the great helmsman, Chairman Mao Zedong, stood on the rostrum at the north of Tiananmen Square. The gate of heavenly peace is what those three characters mean. He stood up and said, Jintian Zhongguo Jilaila. Today, China has stood up. Mao's motto was, power comes with the barrel of a gun. So the People's Republic of China, another communist country, came into being. The frogs were croaking loudly. When Stalin died in 1953, communist power had spread to 11 countries. Living conditions greatly improved under communism in China. Everybody strove for three essentials: the iron chair, the iron salary, and the iron rice bowl. What do they mean? The iron chair means a secure job. The iron salary, that is, a good income. And the iron rice bowl, enough to eat. Until the great helmsman made a discovery. He had a brainwave, or was it a brainstorm? He found that many communists in power throughout China were like Hung Luobo. What's a Hung Luobo? A Hung Luobo is a radish. Red on the outside, nominally communist, but white on the inside, a sham. So, in 1966, he ordered another revolution, a cultural revolution, and sent the Red Guards, Red terror squads, to restore true Marxist-Leninism, an orgy of destruction. Now, China has a history of more than 5,000 years. Not only valuable historical artifacts, the only person who had power to stop these thugs was the Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai, but people were forced to confess They were sent to the countryside, re-educated, especially if they had been educated quite well themselves or even overseas. It lost China 10 years and 10 million people. Read Wild Swans and Life and Death in Shanghai. Now, national flags have a meaning. What is the meaning of this flag of the People's Republic of China? Yes, there are 4 little stars there. The 4 modernizations. Modernization of agriculture, modernization of education, modernization of industry, and modernization of the military. The Chinese design and make all their own military equipment, except the very top, which come from Russia. And the large 5-pointed star on a red background, red, revolution and bloodshed, Marxist-Leninism, the 5-pointed star, the 5 inhabited continents. The whole world. Global, isn't it? Revelation 16 verse 14. We must keep up with France's export drive. Travel east to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Excuse me. Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. We had the great leader, his son, the dear leader, and his son, Kim Jong-un. Moved south from China. They took over Tibet. They're interfering in Nepal, Maoists, in the buffer states between South China and India, Bhutan, and so on. Vietnam, an attempt at the British Malaya, take over British Malaya in 1948 to 60, was thwarted at great cost of lives and money. So if you're looking at this 5-pointed star, perhaps the centre peak could represent Europe, and the right-hand point of the star could go to China and the east. That's accounted for. But what about the left-hand point? How is communism alive and well in the Americas? Cuba, Fidel Castro and his brother Raul have gone. But Russia has a finger in the pie in Venezuela. But what about communism in America itself? It's alive and well. The League of Nations, after World War I, was a failure. So, New York, January the 1st, 1942, 26 nations signed the Declaration of United Nations. The communists were in on the ground floor, so to speak, helping to set it all up, organize it, all its rules, and so on and so on. 3 Americans, Alger Hiss, Harry Hopkins, and Harry Dexter White. 1 or 2 of them were advisors to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But these 3 were found to be paid up, card-carrying members of the Communist Party. And did not the old USSR, the Union of Soviet Social Republics, frequently say no to Western policies at the United Nations, and do not Russia and China, both members of the 25-member United Nations Security Council, don't those 2 frequently use their power of veto today? What about the left downward point of this 5-pointed star? Or perhaps that might refer to the African continent. Chinese have been helping to build infrastructure in some countries. But what about Robert Mugabe, 37 years in Zimbabwe. His communist policies of force and terror to oust white farmers, so turning Zimbabwe from the breadbasket of that part of Africa to poverty. But coming towards the end, when dealing with Chinese officialdom, I say officialdom, one has to remember three things. The warning of George Macartney, envoy to China in 1793, later Lord Macartney and ambassador. He summed up his findings. In China, he said, there are many versions of the truth. And then we have the warning of Deng Xiaoping, veteran Chinese Communist Army commander of the Long March and the Civil War, president in the 1990s, architect of opening up and reform. And what does he say? We can always fool a foreigner. And, one more, be careful what you believe that comes out of China, especially if it has been officially denied. And so, the left point of the five-pointed star, what's happening there? We've got one country, two systems for 50 years in Hong Kong, now being badly shaken. Protesters have stormed the Legislative Council. What else is China doing down in this part of the world? At colossal cost, the Chinese have constructed artificial island bases in the South China Sea, straddling international shipping lanes. And in June, just a few weeks ago, an exclusive report by Barbara Drever. Who's Barbara Drever? Pacific correspondent of Television New Zealand 1 News. And this was broadcast on the 6 p.m. news, and I'm sorry I didn't write down what day. But what did Barbara Drever report? Vanuatu in the Solomon Isles has switched ties from nationalist China to communist China. And China has agreed to construct and pay for port facilities somewhere to take cruise ships for the tourist trade at enormous cost. Can Vanuatu repay? I say not. And in the next breath, Barbara Drever reported China is looking for a military base somewhere in the South Pacific, right on Australia's doorstep. And not a word of all this in the papers. And China is doing this by the well-tried Zoho Men method. Zoho Men, what's all that about? You know, if you're in China, and I spent 10 years in China, if you want to get something that's very hard to get, a seat on a train in the Chinese New Year, you never attempt to go in and get it by the front door. All you'll get is mayo. That's not mayonnaise. It means not have. Or it means I have got it, but not for you. Or it means I've got it, but I'm too lazy to go and get it. So ho man, walk back door. And so China then is getting into places in the South Pacific and New Zealand by the back door. And they're using the Belt and Roads method. Instead of the long-haul shipping route from their country to some countries to export, the Chinese will construct roads and facilities and railways so that you can buy their goods much cheaper than you can make them, and much cheaper than Western countries can provide them. So you will buy our goods, won't you? And we don't want our very large population to be unemployed, and we have a revolution. So we work by the NIMBY method, NIMBY, not in my backyard. We don't want a revolution in China, but have a revolution in your country, that's quite okay. And when in the morning the inhabitants, the population of these other countries, they wake up finding that their economy has been taken over by China, they've now lost their sovereignty. So the frogs have won again. This 5-pointed red star. Revolution. We can always fool a foreigner. And then you've got the 5-eye alliance. We'll not go into that, but do remember this. Huawei. Huawei means say hello. Huawei is not connected to the Chinese government. We have nothing to hide. Over a 4-week period, perhaps late May and into June of this year, the lifetime leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a nuclear power, travelled across the border to Vladivostok in Russia, Russia's Far East ice-free port and naval base. And Vladimir Putin, trying to be lifelong Prime Minister or President, he hops from one to the other to suit, of the nuclear-powered Russian Federation, travelled to meet him. And not long after, lifelong President Xi Jinping of nuclear-powered People's Republic of China travelled to Moscow and St. Petersburg for talks. Oh, by the way, Vladimir means ruler of the world. Now, this shuttle diplomacy continued when President Xi Jinping now travelled from Beijing to Pyongyang to meet Kim Jong-un, to boost ties. No leader from those countries had met for 14 years. And last, but not least, Kelvin Davis, New Zealand's Minister of Tourism, headed to China to strengthen ties. Watch this space. So let's get closer to the conclusion. What is God's opinion of communism? Deuteronomy 29, verse 18. And one version reads, make sure, no half measures, make sure there is no man or woman having a root that beareth gall or wormwood. The root of a plant is hidden in the soil, and in due time the plant breaks the surface and brings forth an attractive flower. There are red, and there are mauve, and there are white varieties of this plant. So, when the flower appears, it identifies what it is. But it is disastrous in its influence. And so it is with false, godless philosophies and doctrine. So God told the Israelites through Moses, evil influences must be rooted out. Get on your gardening gloves and dig the stuff out. Get them out of the human mind, the human clay. Gall, Roche, Gessensius identifies this as the poppy that produces a narcotic drug, opium, and opium dulls the mind and makes one lethargic, and you make the wrong decisions. you find yourself in a stupor. This plant is a native of the Eastern Mediterranean, to which the Israelites were going to reside. Artifacts from Sumerian times depict this easily recognized plant. Know your enemy. Perhaps Abraham would have known of it. But communism is like rust. It never sleeps. It's always working, if but silently, to corrode, erode, to break down and destroy structures from within. Rosh, the ancient Hebrew word for Russia, north of Israel. Frog-like spirits out of its mouth. It's yet to take Constantinople and attack Israel from the north quarters, Ezekiel 38. We haven't time to look at it. Yet to be buried in Israel, Ezekiel 39, verse 11. Before that, it will be an alliance, the frog-like spirits of the beast of the earth, Europe, and the frog-like spirits of the false prophet. All three in alliance, Catholicism and communism. But fortunately, God has more power than any communist, Catholic conspiracy. The river Euphrates, the Ottoman Empire, dried up. Revelation 16, verse 12. Why? That the way of the kings out of the sun's rising, out of the east, might be prepared. And do you know that that could include you and I, kings of the future, kings and priests, and reign with the Lord Jesus Christ on earth for 1,000 years. Remember Louis XIV, the Roi Soleil, the Sun King? He died, the sun set. But us, as immortals, will not die. People called Louis XIV Dieudonné, God-given. If God gives us immortality in his mercy, we shall have more power than Louis XIV and many others. We wrote in our advertisement that France's greatest export was still spreading globally. Liberty, equality, fraternity, communism, evolution, humanism, all deny the existence of God. All deny the existence of a higher, supreme, moral power. Those boastful, poisonous teachings, camouflaging reality, claim that man can control his own destiny, that man is at liberty to do what he wants. Liberty, they cry. License is what they mean. Self-expression is the new normal in whatever sphere he chooses. And this policy of madness is being insidiously spread into the minds of pupils at school, students at unis, causing the breakdown and collapse of society. Equality, unisex, same-sex, marriage. God's simple, straightforward, easy to understand moral law, for man's benefit, mind you, was one man, one woman, and they twain shall be one flesh for life. And what have we got in place of that? We have a multitude of deviations, variations, combinations, complications, which 50 years ago were wrong and punishable. God's laws haven't changed. But in today's spirit of fraternity, no hard feelings, please, don't anyone dare say, people who do those things, don't anyone dare say that they're wrong, because if you do, now it's you who'll get punished. a revolution has occurred. But what were the revolutionaries, the protesters, the activists looking? Liberty from cruel oppression by their fellow men, one law for all, fraternity. They were looking for bread, peace, and agrarian reform, land. They were looking for an iron chair, an iron salary, and an iron roast bowl. Yet all these are promised and will be provided in the restored kingdom of God on earth. After World War III, and under the millennial rule of the Lord Jesus Christ and his immortal followers, kings out of the sun's rising, and you and I, in the mercy of God, if one does something about it now before it's too late, can be part of it. Read in your own time Psalm 72, a peaceful and just society. Isaiah 35 verse 1, the desert shall blossom as the rose. Most unlikely places being productive. Amos 9 verse 13, the ploughman shall overtake the reaper. But what does that mean? In the war years in England, another boy, George Oakley, and I, both 14, school holidays, it was our job on the farm. He drove the tractor, I sat on the reaper binder. And later we both ploughed the fields. But in the future age, the crops will be so bountiful that the harvesters won't have enough time to gather them in before it's time to get the horses and the tractors in to plowing the ground again. Micah 4 verse 4. Every man under his own vine and fig tree. No fear. Right? The Israelitish umbrella, the vine and the fig tree. There'll be one God, one religion, one king, one law, a level playing field. You don't need a college, a university education to understand the basic truth of God's written word, the Bible. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honour of kings is to search out a matter. Communism is all around us, is closer than you think, affecting us more than you think. Unfortunately, at the return of Christ, it will all be swept away and replaced. The question is, are you ready to save yourself and the family and your family from the Holocaust to come, when all these evils are going to be swept away and replaced? Your eternal future and those of your family are at stake. In Chinese, Wanda, she is in Neiman. Finished. Thank you. In French, fini. Merci beaucoup.